Good evening, everybody. My name is David Steiner. I have the honor and privilege, yes, thank you, we pay him a lot, to not enough, to chair the Hopkins Hunter Education Forum. As some of you know, I was privileged to be the Dean of the School of Education at Hunter, and I'm honored that some of my former colleagues are here with us, now directing the Institute for Education Policy at Johns Hopkins University. The topic tonight is one of ever-increasing importance. The estimates of what this country spends on K-12 technology are frankly all over the lot. There are multiple numbers. I've heard 9 billion, 12 billion, 13 billion. It's a lot. More importantly than the numbers are the hopes that have been invested in this new technology. They vary from the hope that we will meet every child exactly where she is and have technology take her to the necessary next step, be that each day, each week, each month, or each year, to hopes for new forms of assessment, to hopes to bring new subject matter to students in rural areas. Where else and how else might a student in Montana learn Mandarin than through technology? There are so many hopes invested in technology that one barely knows where to start. At the same time, one is humbled by history. I was joking with one of our speakers that my father wrote 27 books with this. And when this gave way to the typewriter, and the typewriter gave way to the computer, and television began, those of you who are old enough will remember the enormous excitement over television. It was going to transform learning in our era. Then when the first computers came, much the same argument. That is not to say that the past is prologue to the future. We may be at an inflection point. We may not. That is one of the issues we will discuss this evening. I'm delighted by our panelists because so often we get discussions from one point of view, one perspective. Here we have some of the very best research available in the country from Julia. We have an entire district represented, and not just any district, but Washington, D.C., which, as many of you know, has perhaps been the most improved urban district in the United States in the last few years with extraordinary leadership and work by its teachers and district folk. And we have a school, a real school, that believes in the use of technology and is pioneering in many ways innovative uses that we are all fascinated to look at. So 3 very different perspectives. We will, as always, have presentations that will be relatively brief. Then we will have a panel discussion, which I will moderate. And then, of course, as always, questions from the audience. So I'm looking forward to a terrific discussion. We will follow the order that you see. As part of our custom, I will not be reading the long bios because nothing is as boring as having someone read what you can read. But these are really impressive folks, as I've said, and it is our real delight to welcome Julia and Jamie and Kevin. It'll actually be Julia, Kevin, and Jamie in that order of conversation. And so, Julia, why don't you go first?
Now, it's Murphy's Law that when you're presenting on the great potential of education technology, that the technology fails, so you will bear with us. Okay, thank you so much, David, and thanks all for coming out on this rainy evening to hear about a topic that, as David said, there's a lot of conversation about, there's a lot of spending on, but there's also a lot of confusion on what we mean when we say online learning, blended learning, personalized learning. Now, I'm putting up this chart. The Christensen Institute, by the way, is a nonprofit think tank that has studied the rise of online learning. And this is really the premise of our work, is this chart. It came out in a 2008 book by Michael Horn and Clay Christensen, looking at the disruptive trajectory that online learning was taking relative to traditional teacher-led instruction. And there's this startling statistic that we predicted, which is that by 2019, 50% of all high school courses would be online in some form or fashion. Now, I first read this in 2008 when I was not working at the Institute. And I, like, if I'm reading some of the faces in the room today, I felt a bit of trepidation. Because this could tell a variety of stories, right? One story could be, we're investing in online learning because it's cheaper. We're going to drive down the cost of delivering learning, but we're not going to see an uptick in quality. That's one story. Another story, equally maybe depressing, is that maybe we're not going to hurt quality, but we're simply going to digitize the old system, right? We're going to digitize what we've always done, which is basically what I'm doing to you right now, treat you like little vessels, talk at you, and hope, knock on wood, that you understand what I'm talking about, right? So because of those two fears, and I'll say a third fear, right, that others may be thinking is that we're simply going to replace teachers. That high school is going to get hollowed out, right? And that as we hollow out 50% of courses, kids are going to be sitting in their pajamas at home taking these courses, and school as we know it is going to disappear. Now, one statistic that I'm not representing here is that when you do the same calculation for homeschooling, even in the crazed libertarian states, and I'm married to a libertarian, so I'm allowed to say that, homeschooling taps out at about 10%. So what we're seeing happen is actually the rapid growth of online learning, but brick and mortar here to stay. And that's where this term blended learning really came about, at least in our lingo, to describe the combination of online learning and brick and mortar locations. Largely the reason that we founded the Christensen Institute was to try and ensure that this pattern, which is a market-driven pattern, because online learning is cheaper, does offer cost savings, but that this pattern actually leads to better differentiated instructional models rather than the cramming of online lectures into traditional models. So what is blended learning? I won't belabor the details of the definition since I know you all can read this, but I want to really home in on a couple key principles here, particularly this third piece, which is that we're connecting what's happening online and offline in the instructional model. This is not, to date myself to a particular era in computer software, me going and playing Oregon Trail and then learning fractions, right? Those two modalities, although there was an online and a face-to-face, were never connected with data. But the hope in a blended learning model is that you have this virtuous cycle of an online software experience providing meaningful data to educators who can then differentiate better face-to-face. Common misconception. Even though we are in a room, some of you are checking your email, there is a projector, we are not doing blended learning, right? So just having technology in a classroom does not make it a blended classroom. We're also hearing increasingly about governors and mayors and superintendents promising one-to-one rollouts, which is essentially saying we'll have a laptop for every child. Now, we've actually heard that for more than 10 years in this country, right? And we know that that has not fundamentally changed instructional models. There's a temptation to sort of flock to the stuff, the hardware and the software, before actually rethinking instruction. And so really, although there's classrooms across the United States where teachers are using technology in creative ways, let's say to have students write essays on Google Docs or do research online, that's not what we mean when we say blended learning. We mean deliberately integrating technology and online learning into an instructional model. Now, this is sort of our taxonomy that we came up with over the past 5 years. The gist of this, so we went out and we surveyed over 100 schools. This is not meant to be prescriptive. This is not saying this is what classrooms should or shouldn't look like. We simply went out, there were a bunch of people saying we're doing blended learning, and we started to codify what we were seeing across their classrooms into this taxonomy. And what it basically describes is some models that may look quite familiar to traditional classrooms. For example, a station rotation. Any elementary school teachers in the room will know that the centers model has been around for a long time, where we divided young kids up into small groups and rotated them. In a station rotation blended learning model, you're swapping in an online learning experience into one of those stations. Otherwise, it's going to look pretty traditional. On the other hand, and what you'll be hearing about later today, there's models that are really pushing out there in terms of you can't even tell what the back of the classroom is because students are moving through learning in a much more flexible way. The space is really freed up. Other models, you'll see even a sort of bullpen that looks like a Dilbert cartoon where kids are at cubicles and at computers and everyone sort of passes out, and then they come to and they realize there's breakout rooms where kids are actually interacting with humans. But the point is that these are a variety of models. Blended learning, if you take away one thing from this, I hope it's that blended learning is not one thing. And the conversation right now tends to be, oh, blended learning is this thing we can take off a shelf and then we're doing it and it's an intervention of sorts. Blended learning describes a host of instructional models we're seeing crop up as educators use technology to hopefully differentiate in new ways. Now, preparing for this talk, this is sort of a cliche photo, but preparing for this talk, I was thinking to myself, sometimes, especially given the prompt for this conversation, we can get very technocratic very quickly. So I'm describing a very tidy way that we're going to redesign learning, and we're going to have all this data at our fingertips. Now, first of all, best kept secret in EdTech today is that it is very tricky to get data out of some software programs and integrate it into a coherent picture of how students are performing. So we're way behind this sort of data nirvana that I think we think we have. But the other thing, particularly to our question about closing the achievement gap, is that if a student arrives at school hungry, no software program is going to solve that, right? And I think we need to be measured and reasonable about how we talk about the potential of technology, perhaps to differentiate instruction, but not to completely mitigate the effects of poverty. We've written extensively, and this is actually what my own research focuses on how much schools are going to need to integrate across the value chain of a student's life to support and mitigate what may be happening in terms of poverty, health, mental health, all sorts of factors that contribute to learning that, again, software programs are not solving for. They are a piece of a puzzle that can enhance what we've tried to do in instructional models for a long time and struggle to differentiate against. So I promise to be brief. That's it for now, and I'll let David ping me with research questions after we finish up.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you to David and to Hunter, Johns Hopkins. I'm really excited to be here and to share the work that DC Public Schools is doing, particularly from a district level, and hopefully some lessons that we've learned over time, and also the places that we're going. So I'd love to share this photo first, that I will not be sharing with you any kind of LeBron-esque slam dunk, what can I take back to my district, what can I take back to my school set of things. I do think that sometimes success is in the eye of the beholder, and I think that we've seen success according to the ways that we've determined we wanted to roll out our model. And of course, at a district level, it's not the same at any one school. There's different contexts even within our own district. Something I'd like to share is a few things that I think make our district unique and that have helped us to have this culture of innovation and ways to help improve our students' academic performance. So just a couple of things. We do have a set of leadership, as was mentioned in the intro, that really has supported our innovation and has supported different models in schools, particularly those of our schools that are most struggling, with our Chancellor, Kaya Henderson, and our chief in my office of teaching and learning, Brian Pick, who's really helped us be innovative. And also something unique about my team, so I work on the education and technology team, also the blended learning team, sort of back and forth. We sit within the curriculum and instruction shop, which is unique among many districts. A lot of times EdTech sits within an operations shop. We do have our operations folks that help with our everyday, making sure our network is up and making sure our devices are sound for students. But we are really focused on carrying out the instructional needs that our content teams determine are best. So we really view our content leads, our math director, our science director, et cetera, as the real drivers of the work that we do and what we're doing within schools. So I'd like to share with you also just a video that we have that might give you an idea, a little bit about blended learning. This is a little from a year or so ago, but I think it gives the gist of what we are seeing.
One of the things that has made DCPS incredibly successful is our ability to innovate. And we've been very careful about the strategies that we've put in place to make our schools not just high performing, but great places for our young people.
Now today we're going to look at a core interactive text.
Blended learning is a combination of using face-to-face instruction and also leveraging high-quality digital content that is going to engage them, it's going to challenge them, it's going to be rigorous, and it's also related to the standards. In my class, I do a station rotation. So there are some students with me receiving direct instruction. There's another group of students who are working collaboratively to solve a problem or issue, and then a third group who is working independently.
The power of blended learning is that you can really differentiate instruction and individualize and personalize it for all your learners.
Each section, each 1/6, I need to split into 1/4.
Oh, all of them have.
Yes, good, excellent. Go ahead and do that. For the majority of our students, it's their first actual chance to work with computers on a daily basis.
On the computers, you get to choose a level, and once you pass that level, you go to the next level and the next level and the next level.
Students are progressing very quickly, and it's actually helping all of our students at all levels.
We believe that blended learning is really the lever to accelerate student achievement and meet our goals.
There are a lot of
student achievement has increased in the areas of math as we have launched our blended learning programs.
So let's do 22 divided by, okay, let's try 8.
And we've seen some very promising results in the area of English language arts.
S-T-U, me and you, B-W-S, yes, yes, yes.
Everybody takes responsibility and is accountable for the success of the students here. So that's really the kind of teamwork that it takes.
We should be excited about blended learning because students are excited about it. We know from data that they are mastering skills, they're mastering content, that they come to school because they want to engage and they want to learn.
We have 47,000 young people, and we believe that we have a commitment to provide them with a world-class education. Strategies like blended learning and technology in our classrooms have yielded some of the tremendous results that we're seeing so far.
So to Julia's point earlier, probably what a lot of you did not, or a lot of what you did not see was one-to-one rollouts. I think that has not been a focus of ours. Really the focus that we've had and why we think blended learning is successful is that it focuses on and protects the teacher's time. The teacher is still the central person within that classroom and is the one that is making the instructional decisions in there. The digital content, especially if it is adaptive and if it is high quality, can take some of those tasks that the teacher does not have enough time to do, like, for example, learning your times tables is something that I used to do as a middle grades teacher over and over and over again, and that wasn't necessarily the best way for me to spend my time, especially in an era of rolling out our Common Core standards. So what I'd like to show a little bit of is just our progress as a district as a whole. Some of these things we'd like to think blended learning is helping to accelerate our improvement. I don't think that any one of these things is like, this is what blended learning has done in DCPS, but again, this is something that we'd like to believe we're accelerating that conversation. So we are a large urban school district, high free and reduced lunch population. We have 112 schools now, 49,000 students. I know she mentioned 47,000 earlier, our chancellor. One of our district goals is to increase our enrollment, so we've seen some tremendous gains in that area. When I talked before about how we sit within our curriculum and instruction shop, and our content leads being the real drivers of what we're doing in DCPS, particularly for my team. These are also our 5 big goals from our strategic plan that really drive us every day about what is it that we're trying to accomplish for our students. So for each one of these, I think that we really try and see how do we fit into those. I highlighted particularly investing in our 40 most at-risk schools, our most struggling schools, because we've focused a lot of our investment with resources as well as professional development and a lot of these new models on those lowest performing schools to help increase the innovation of those places. So again, some of these are going to be results that are just overall for DCPS. This is on our previous assessment prior to the park from 2007 to 2014, which was the last time we gave that assessment. So as you can see, we had increases in reading and in math for both of those. Now with Park, we're going into our second year of implementation, so we'll be able to see with that assessment if those numbers hold up, or really with especially a more rigorous assessment and in an era of Common Core, what our students are and how they are performing. If you drill down deeper into that data, the CAS data again, so this is still our previous assessment, but if you drill down deeper, there was improvements in each one of our subgroups. If you could look all the way to the right, the Hispanic students in particular were leading growth on the math side. Change in enrollment, we talked a little bit about that. I think that when we talk about blended learning solving everything, like changing enrollment and increasing enrollment is not necessarily the thing you're going to look for to say, oh, what is the thing that's going to get students to come to school, but it could be a contributing factor to them being more engaged and to showing up to school. Or alternatively, also, we've seen some success with students being able to complete digital content outside of school, so it's increasing the learning time, the school day throughout. I mentioned before we were going to talk a lot about our grade 4 results on the NAEP, so not just with our own assessments, but with a national assessment, we're seeing our school district is the fastest improving of the large urban school districts in the country for both reading and math in 4th grade. 8th grade is a little tougher. Here's our math scores. So down to something specific about blended learning in a program, we like to look at ST Math as one of our premier implementations. It was an opt-in model, so that's something else that we really try to do with our principals. We give them the choice to say, these are the things that you need to do in order to meet a program's fidelity, and these are the resources that you'll need. This is the professional development and the program that we will provide. And so then they tell us, okay, that's something we're willing to do and we're willing to spend time on. This is an evaluation, I believe this is from ST, but we do have our own internal Office of Data and Strategy as well as some external to evaluate our programs to make sure that we're staying on track, to make sure that we're always improving our effectiveness. And this just shows that students that were in similar schools, those that had ST Math, again, this is on CAS, so on our previous assessment, but those that used ST Math to that high fidelity threshold, that were actually spending the time that they needed to spend that was determined for high fidelity, increased far and above students that had no ST Math for that school year. Julia mentioned some of the spectrum of what we're going for, or really of blended learning as a whole. We don't have any fully online schools in DC. We do have some schools that are, or fewer and fewer, truthfully, that are just using a traditional instructional model of brick and mortar, no digital content. We do have a portfolio approach of having digital content available in lots of our schools and lots of our different content areas. But one of our first schools that went to a full model was Randall Highlands Elementary, along with Ketchum Elementary, and this is that sort of easily accessible model of the rotation because teachers in the elementary grades are very used to the centers idea. So this was sort of an easy swap out of saying this is something you're familiar with. We think that this will increase your student achievement and has been really successful for us. And another point I wanted to drive is that before Randall Highlands and Ketchum, we had no proof points within our own school district. So a lot of times what we were hearing when we were talking to teachers about being innovative, about what they were looking for, they didn't want to come to New York, they didn't want to go to California, they wanted to see it happen in DC public schools. And it was really important for us to have one of these homegrown proof points that we can send teachers to, and now we still, as teachers think about doing a rotation model, they really want to come back and see Randall or even second generation, third generation schools that have tried this model. So that's the elementary side. Secondary is definitely a little tougher. There's a different mentality in secondary. I think as a former secondary teacher, I was definitely the stand and deliver kind of guy. And I really liked that sense of control and going forth with that. So we're still trying to figure out exactly what's best for our secondary schools and trying new things. One thing that I'd like to highlight up here is we're partnering with Summit, the Summit Network, to do their base camp program, which goes to show that, yes, we can learn things from charter schools, and we love to take the best practices from our partners in that sector, but also that it really helps us to think about where we want our own students to go and where we want to develop our program. And so I'll just leave you before we do the question time. That picture doesn't really have anything to do with it. I just think it's the best picture that we have. But that we really are focused on student-driven learning, that we're really trying to push to getting students to create and to develop those non-cognitive skills of goal setting, of being a master of their own learning, of really driving their own instruction. And that's where we're trying to go with professional development and with our own students. So I look forward to questions and appreciate it. Thank you. Thank you.
I'm so excited to hear about District of Columbia Public Schools. It was the first place that I had the pleasure to teach. And I kept looking at those pictures to see if I recognized any of my students who are middle school aged by now, if not a little bit older. And I miss. As an educator for almost 10 years now, I get asked a lot, especially this time of year, what motivates me to stay in the classroom and what I'm excited about going forward. And it's, aside from the students who I get to show you some pictures of in just a few minutes, it's things like this. It's learning from colleagues who are studying different systems, who very clearly and articulately believe in educators and believe in listening to the work that's happening in the classroom and taking those best practices and sharing them. And so I'm more than humbled and excited to be here today to share some things that we have learned over the course of the last couple of years and hear thoughts and get questions from everybody. So I work for AltSchool. AltSchool is an education technology company that is headquartered in San Francisco, California. We open what we call micro schools. Micro school right now is a school with between 40 and 150 students. We have 5 campuses in the Bay Area, and I am out here now as I opened our first outside of California location in Brooklyn Heights this past fall. My name is Jamie. So what is AltSchool? AltSchool was started by our CEO, Max, as he was looking for a program for his daughter to enter into preschool. And he had a really specific idea in his head about what her preschool experience would look like. But all he really wanted was for something that would engage her. And he wanted and expected to find a program that not only worked and fit and felt right for their family, but that was widely available to lots and lots and lots of families. And what he found were that there were really, really great programs, Montessori and Waldorf and Reggio, but they were really hard to get into. There just weren't a lot of spots. And the process for applying and being part of it was pretty cumbersome. And as part of the work that he was doing at the time for Google, he started to dream up a situation where this kind of education that was engaging and personalized and included components of technology was available for all different kinds of students. And so AltSchool was born. We are here to reimagine education to enable all children to reach their full potential. And that is what drew me to AltSchool. My background is as a special education teacher, and I really loved that work. I loved working for the schools in DCPS, and I loved working for the middle school I moved to San Francisco to work at too. But I found as I continued my work, a lot of limitations imposed by the system, that I got to spend a lot of time getting to know my students really, really, really well, and then would need to spend an equal amount of time sort of plugging that knowledge of them into the curriculum and systems that existed. And so I started looking for options for my students sort of outside of that, knowing that they were incredibly capable and bright and creative and passionate, and that I could hopefully find something that fit that better for them. And I heard of AltSchool through the grapevine and got the opportunity to go visit the very first campus, which was truly a one-room schoolhouse in the Dogpatch neighborhood of San Francisco, and really fell in love with the energy and the excitement that I saw from a really diverse group of students, and diverse sort of across all the ways that you can think of it. But the thing that struck me the most was that there was clearly a lot of different learning styles in that room, and that through the use of integrated technology and experiences and tools and exposure, they were really excited to be there and could articulate their passions and their goals and their challenges. And these were 5 and 6 and 7-year-olds. So what we have learned over the last 3 years now with AltSchool is we have grown from that one-room schoolhouse of 10 students to around 350 this current school year. Really is that we are rooted in personalized learning, but the way that we're starting to define that now is based on a couple of core principles that are outside of technology and exist sort of secondary to or before our secondary technology. And that is a lot around whole child education, that we really start with getting to know students on a personal level and spend the first couple of weeks of school observing and collecting academic data. We do some standardized tests for students who are at appropriate grade levels. We do Fontes and Pinnell running records. We're using the best tools that we have as educators to find out the things that we are going to help us be the most ready to teach our group of students. And then we start building the curriculum from there. And that is tied to rigorous academics. We do rely on Common Core standards. We rely on next generation science standards, social emotional learning standards that come from places like Castle. But that we're again starting from the place of knowing the students and then building curriculum for them. And that curriculum we truly believe is best when it is interdisciplinary and project-based. And I'll talk a little bit later about how the technology that we are building in-house helps us as educators collect the assessment data that Julia and Kevin were talking about that exist in lots of different places. And from my perspective as an educator, it was really hard to synthesize and truly not just understand where my students were at, but know exactly where to take them next and how to document that and make sure that I was communicating it not just internally to myself and my co-teachers and the other people interacting with the students, but to families and to students themselves, for them to have a really clear idea of who they are as learners. And again, the technology that we have begun to build helps us see that picture of that student and connect them to the other students in their groups or in their community, and then say this is the kind of learning experience, or this is the project that is going to give you the best experience coming up. And we do a lot of that through community involvement. I, as an educator, can only be an expert in so many things, and this year has taught me that at every turn, or my students come to school really interested in the Mets, and I'm brand new to New York, and so I reach out to people who know a little bit more about it, or students want to learn, and the curriculum is taking us on a path where we're going to do a project that involves circuitry. And instead of spending all of my days and nights becoming an expert in circuitry, I stay the expert in my students, and I rely on community to come and help do that. On top of that, and I hope I have a picture of it, our Brooklyn Heights campus exists above a pizza place. And if you are a 5-year-old or if you're a 31-year-old, and you get to be above pizza every day, it's sort of a dream come true. So again, talking a little bit more about our personalization and what that means in our eyes looks different for every student. It looks like goals that might be whole class goals. That we do spend a lot of time in things like morning meeting and collaborative community work with a whole group. But we also want to know things about students' interests and where they're driven to. We want to give them a really wide exposure to arts and science and different kinds of movement. We did Zumba this year, and nothing is more exciting than your pre-K students pumped about their Zumba class first thing in the morning. And now they know if Zumba is something that they like, and they know it at a really young age, or something that they're interested in learning more about. Also providing transparency to students, and we do that through, similar to lots of other schools and systems that we're learning a ton from all the time, what we call a playlist, where students have, either on a daily or weekly basis, depending sort of on the age and grade range of the students, access to the work that they're doing, and access to seeing the pictures of them interacting with other students, and the pictures or captures of the work that they have completed or are in the motions of being involved with. And that feeds really well into, and Kevin and Julia talked about this too, student motivation. That we want students, and we know through so much research and evidence that students learn best when they're excited, when their amygdalas are calm and they can be at school ready to learn. And that happens for all of us when we know the next thing that's going to happen, when circumstances are predictable, but when there's a spark and an interest and a curiosity that happens too. And then ongoing reflection and constantly collecting information, not just from teachers and parents, but also from students. So this is a snapshot of the day in the life of some students across a couple of age bands. And I think this is kind of our version right now of what blended learning looks like in different environments. And David showed us earlier the pin in his pocket. We talk a lot about all kinds of tools and how the technology for everyone has evolved so much since we started offering what traditional school looks like right now, from chalkboard and chalk, which is a thing again. There's tons of chalkboard and chalk in my classroom right now, to having personal devices that students have access to throughout the day. And this starts really with our students who are older. So you'll see on the far side there a classroom of pre-K kindergarten students who are using a workstation, and they have access to things like hammers and nails and real tools that they're building with, all the way through the middle picture where we have some of our middle school students out in California rotating through centers with an educator. Just a quick snapshot again of our technology. The center picture is our student playlist, where kids are getting access to the work and the experiences that are being collected. And the learning progression there on the other side is right now where we are collecting data and assessments. And this comes from some of the third-party tools that we're using. We're using measures of academic progress, Lexia, Newsella, Khan Academy in some of our classrooms. But this is also teacher input and teacher assessment on scales for any of the work that students are completing, sometimes in the moment and sometimes beyond. And how these systems can work together to help us, again, as educators, sort of superpower our ability to personalize, because there's lots of moving parts that happen in a single moment. And I'll hold the questions now for our Q&A. Thanks.
Wherever you like. There we go. Thank you. Let me ask each one of you an individual question, and then more generally. So Julia, let's start with you as someone who's deep in the research. What is the research base?
Yep.
Are there double-blind randomized studies that show the impact of technology on academic learning gains for underprivileged students?
So David knows the answer to this question, which is why he's asking it. So I'm going to question the hypothetical because I went to law school, so I enjoy doing that. I think it's the wrong question to ask to say, does blended learning work? Because it's tantamount to asking, do textbooks work? Does small group instruction work? Do all the things that we're doing, to your point, using different tools work? So that's my disclaimer. What we do have, so we had the most recent...
So the answer to the question is no.
The answer to the question is no in terms of, yeah. Do you want me to stop at that?
No, I just wanted to establish it. Now we can move on.
So we do have some promising research now, and I would push on whether RCT should be king in all of this anyways from a research methodology.
RCT for the audience, randomized controls.
Sorry, yeah, whether randomized controlled trials should be the sort of king gold standard in all of this. But we have a RAND study that came out last year, sponsored by the Gates Foundation, looking at over 60 schools serving over 11,000 students doing personalized learning. We've heard that term a lot now. It's a pretty capacious term, but many of these schools were using blended learning, and students were doing better on average than their peers not attending those schools. We also have studies of particular tools, which we can point to. ST Math was mentioned. There's a decent study out on that. Carnegie Learning's Cognitive Tutor showing 8 percentile gains on average. Now, the irony of, let's just stick on that study for 1 second. The irony of that is that it's a rigorous study. We hear 8 percentile gains, but we are using the old average yardstick to measure efficacy, right? So what 8 percentile gains on average tells me is that there's actually a subset of students for which Carnegie Learning Cognitive Tutor is not the right tool. And in theory, if we're in a flexible environment, we should actually be able to use different tools for different students, and that should be part of this personalization craze, right? And so I would urge, from a research perspective, not necessarily to say, does blended learning work, and now we have the randomized control trial to show it, but rather, are we figuring out what software and what experiences work for what students in what circumstances, and are we opening up the system to be able to sort of deploy those in a nimble way?
Got it. And Jamie, you obviously are in a data-rich environment. What are you showing so far to prospective parents? What do you say to them about the performance of students on academic measures?
And our biggest, that is a question we get all the time, our biggest talking point really is coming from current students and families, where we are collecting a ton of data, but it's for each student and not looking at it from my perspective as an educator collectively. What I am aiming to do is to grow each student's individual level, reading level, by a year or a year and a half, or maybe half a year, depending on who that child is, and being in constant communication with families around and with students around what that looks like and what that's going to entail for them and why that goal was set. And then telling the stories of either students who were not set up for success in the schools that they were coming from and are now really happy and motivated and possibly therefore more successful in a school that can give them more flexibility. But yeah, that is our
one child
big data.
Kevin, you were brave enough to mention that the 8th grade results don't look quite as glamorous as the 4th grade results. You're not the only city in the country that has to confess that. NAEP in general shows that, as you know. But I want to broaden the question, because so much of the technology development we've seen in the United States has been at the very earliest grade levels. And for obvious reasons. There are, as you mentioned, why should you teach the multiple times tables when it can be done effectively, right, on a computer? Why do we seem to hit a wall when it comes to older children? And actually, that's a question I'd like to ask for all of you.
Yeah, so I think when you get up into the middle grades, and I'll speak also from my perspective as a former middle grades teacher.
Yes.
When you're being asked to teach students the slope of a line in 8th grade, you have so little time to talk about what a fraction is that it's just not something that you have time to do. I think that means also that some of those earlier skills that we can try and automate, that's something that we try to automate first. And it's tougher to have the more conceptual discussions around the higher level skills that we want students in the middle and higher grades to do. So that's partially why I think ST Math is effective in the younger grades, because it's teaching students to be conceptual and be abstract in earlier and earlier years. But I definitely think that secondary is a place that still needs a lot of development, not just in the model conversation, but or in the content conversation, but also just in how we talk to teachers about what it is that we want students to be able to do. And what we want for even how we have those conversations with students. Like, I think a lot of what we sometimes discuss too, as a final point, is we just sort of expect students to be independent by the time that they're 18, and there's never any really addressing of how do you build those skills in students from the minute that they are entering school up until the end.
Julia, do you want to say something?
Yeah,
about
so I'll say the fastest growing model at the high school level is what we would call the a la carte model. This is like a spoof of a think tank that I give you my language to describe this in, but it's basically that students are taking a single online course with a teacher of record online. And that is growing quite quickly. For the example that you mentioned of the kid in rural America taking Mandarin, there's all sorts of courses that especially cash-strapped high schools can't offer. And this is a way, I will say, to close that access gap to a bunch of coursework. So that is growing quite quickly at the high school level. The other model that's growing really quickly looks a lot like what we sort of saw in the day in the life slide, which we call the flex model, where the backbone of learning is online in sort of a playlist form, and then students are sort of floating offline to do projects, collaborative work, what have you. And one rationale for why that's growing quickly is that part of the challenge with high school, right, is that we keep moving the target. First it was grad rates, now it's college readiness, and then at a subset of schools it's college success and sort of persistence through college. And people in models that are really sort of out innovating are finding that creating these flexible learning environments, allowing students to work collaboratively on projects, if done well, can actually build those skill sets to get kids not just to, but through college. So I think it's growing. I agree it's challenging, and I think from a software content perspective, besides those online courses, there is a dearth of high quality content, which is really limiting.
Are your schools going to be deliberately stuck with certain grade levels, early grade, or are you thinking of moving to higher grade levels?
What a great question. It'll depend on family interest. We have middle school classes right now because parents wanted that. And I can already see the beginnings. We can see the beginnings of interest in high school.
Do you think
I'd go back.
Do you think you'll have to change the models extensively when you do that?
Around the flexibility, that's a really interesting thought about it. And we're starting to see this right now, that colleges are starting to change their approach to teaching and learning. And so a lot of it will depend sort of on the family's end goal, if they're coming to us wanting a 4-year college right out of it, or if they're coming to us wanting some other kind of goal at the end of what would be 12th grade, and how that's on the verge of changing too.
Let me press on a distinction between the use of technology and the constructivist approach to pedagogy. School of one, school for one, school for all. Some of the models that I've seen, including in New York City, were actually very traditionalist in the sense that the instructional approach was not constructivist, but the technology was off the charts, right? The algorithms were being developed every night. There was a new playlist for teachers and students the next morning. There's no necessary allegiance between the technology and a philosophy of education. Are you seeing, however, that most usages tend to go in the constructivist direction? I mean, in Washington, D.C., is that the way the technology is being used?
So I think it varies. And I think that, we've tried, and I think that we will continue to try models that we've seen success with, and we're really intent on focusing also on the models that we've seen success with in our own schools, and trying to, like we were talking about before, trying to create that homegrown, especially in secondary grades, trying to create that homegrown proof point to be able to say, like, this is a model that works for our students and for our schools, and that you can send a school leader from DCPS here and they can see what it looks like and they can adapt it to their own environment. So I think that there's nothing that's totally off limits, because we really just want to support the innovation at the school level and the innovation of the folks that are really.
But presumably you're comparing school performances, right?
Sure, yes.
I mean, I think the critical question there is, what are we trying to digitize, right? So just like, what's the thing, if we could do it in an analog way, that we would do, but we want to do it at scale, so we're going to digitize it. And I think there's a spectrum, to your question, that can be very traditional, and frankly, the majority of schools are still in that spectrum because of the accountability climate, right? What we measure is very sort of traditional, one-off tested. So what you're encouraged to do as a public school right now is pretty traditional. With the uptick of the interest in personalized learning, I think we're seeing kind of two big trends. One is the kind of whole child approach that you heard about happening at AltSchool, which is a very deep philosophical commitment to sort of interests, passions, etc. The other that I already mentioned is this gap that's widening that we're seeing in terms of college success, and we're thinking, crap, these test scores aren't predicting the thing we thought they were, so we're going to have to create other experiences that actually tap into student agency, choice, voice, all the words that we hear in circulation. But from a teacher or a leader perspective, I think the first question, to your point, needs to be, what am I trying to digitize?
So when you look at curriculum, are there certain curriculum that you're seeing work far more effectively in the digitized environment? I mean, are there examples where you take a curriculum that's strong, Singapore math, for example, and you digitize it and it makes it stronger?
So this goes down into, this goes down into our partnership with our curriculum teams, where they're really the ones driving and saying, like, these are the things that we look for when we're looking for a curriculum, and now we're a part of that conversation. So now we can say, well, these are all the other things that you should look for in the digital component of that. Like, you should look for this set of accommodations, you should look for this set of accessibility. And we have our own understanding now, too, of, you know, not necessarily full-blown curricula, but programs like ST Math, how that can be integrated into what they're looking for. So the conversation now becomes, so if we need to, or if we want to, spend time on a digital program, what do we have to talk about with what the curriculum looks like day to day and the pacing guide day to day in order to incorporate something like that?
And are you using mainly off-the-shelf curriculum, or are you developing your own in the AltSchools?
All of the above. One of the exciting components of being an educator right now at AltSchool is that I have access to Teachers College curriculum, and I have access to Turk Math, and I have access to New Zealand and sort of whatever best practice pieces I want to pull from, but I also have access to all of the work my colleagues now across the country are putting together. And so one thing that comes to mind when we think about a more standardized version of a curriculum is one of the teachers last year recorded himself giving lessons, and he was using a pretty standardized curriculum at the time, but wanted to see if there was some difference in student interaction or engagement when it was him in person versus him, the computer him, and what that meant for various students. And the answer that we're continually seeing, which wouldn't surprise anyone, is that it varies student to student. Some students have a preference for one thing.
Last question from me. Does your engagement in all of this impact your view of the future of assessments and accountability? Because after all, 50 state chiefs have now been told to dream it up and essentially just report to us what's going on, but there's no more really tough accountability from Washington, D.C. That was the deal under ESSA. As you play with these tools, as you think about the variety of options you now have, what experiences your students are going through, does it suggest to you different forms of assessment?
Me first. So if you guys recall that chart I put up about the growth spurt of online learning, assessment's going to define the y-axis, right? Whatever we land on in terms of accountability defines how innovations scale, which is sort of incredibly daunting and also has a lot of potential in it. So first I would say we need to talk about assessment and accountability separately, because there's a ton happening in terms of innovative assessment that I don't think we should use for accountability purposes, but that can help teachers day to day in their craft using technology. So that's like a whole bucket of stuff that we should be paying a lot of attention to. I think separately, and David and I were talking about this before the panel, I think the frightening reality is that we have a pretty limited set of instruments at our fingertips right now that states are going to have to choose from. And my hope is that we sort of, unlike we did under No Child Left Behind, we don't lock ourselves into anything for the next 10 years, but we have a sort of iterative process where we're defining what we want to measure and constantly looking for better and better ways to measure that. That maybe a few states will go that direction. But
Any other thoughts on assessment?
I think also teacher assessment is something that's important. So not just at the student level, but also how we evaluate whether what a teacher is doing is effective in the classroom, I think is changing really rapidly. And we've tried as much as we can to help to break down barriers that we see for teachers, so that we have our own evaluation system. How do we train the evaluators to understand that this teacher might be trying something different? This is what you should see in a blended learning classroom, or this is what you should see in an evening credit recovery classroom, and it might not be that every single student is working on the same objective every day. Like that's a very tight accountability thought that doesn't necessarily apply to folks that are trying to go differently along that spectrum, and so we have to think about that too.
Great. Well, enough from me. Questions? Go ahead. I think, is there a mic coming around? Thank you. Michael.
Thank you. I'm Michael Myers. I'm the President, Executive Director of the New York Civil Rights Coalition. One comment for all of you. Excellent. My question relates to technology. When I first went to a computerized library, in the days when I was computer illiterate, I froze. I didn't know how to use the library. I just left. So my question is, in the area of race and social economic, is there a racial social economic gap on the part of the students who come to the classroom with high technology? Do they freeze? Is there a catching up period? And on the other side of that coin, I'm fascinated by this whole technology aspect in terms of the possibilities for student learning. What happens when the usual racial and social forces interfere with your educational mission? For example, in DC, I did not know about blended learning in DC public schools. But knowing it now, I'm fascinated and confused by the school's chancellor in DC proposing such an antiquated notion as a public school for black boys.
There's a lot there. I'll address our approach to talking about equity, particularly in the schools that we invest in. So I mentioned that we have our investment in our 40 lowest performing schools, and those tend to be correlated with those of the lowest socioeconomic performance, right? So that's something that I think we've done. And something else that we've done in terms of developing students' computer literacy skills, like we're in an age of online assessment. Like our students are assessed online all the time. And one of our first schools that did a full blended model was a middle school. And he was saying, this would be great, except my 6th graders come to me and they don't know how to use a mouse, right? So how do we fix that? So one thing that we did, and I mentioned Randall Highlands Elementary School and Ketchum Elementary School, those were 2 feeder schools into that school. So we've been very deliberate with the feeder pattern so that there's a consistent experience for students as they go from there throughout their K through 12 and beyond career to try and develop those skills. I'll let the chancellor talk about her initiative for our all-boys high school. But I do think that we really are focused on our lowest performing schools and trying to improve the equity conversation in DC.
Yeah, just a couple quick thoughts. I mean, the digital divide is real, right? There's some really encouraging federal reform of E-rate and the Lifeline program around access to Wi-Fi and fiber in both schools and neighborhoods. That doesn't close the device divide necessarily, although rates of sort of access to mobile technology are actually quite high even in low-income neighborhoods, which means we should be making sure that tech companies are making everything mobile friendly, not just iPad or laptop friendly. I think you're tapping into a larger theme that crosses race and class, is that students need to know how to learn in these new environments. You have to learn how to learn in an environment that demands new things of you, and I think smart implementations tend to take that into account and scaffold, right? It's a gradual release like any instructional method where students are having to learn how to learn in it. And the last thing I'll say to the maybe more loaded comment that we're gonna avoid, so this is a plug for my own research, but I have been increasingly sort of disenchanted with the fact that we're only using technology as a sort of content and assessment tool, and we're so squarely focused on what students know, and we're ignoring who they know, even though as adults we use technology to expand our networks and invest in social capital constantly. So what I've been tracking, there's a small but mighty growing population of folks that are trying to figure out how to use technology to break open networks for students, particularly those who grow up in isolation because they're in a poor neighborhood. Yeah, so there's online coaching and mentoring programs. There's programs that are porting experts into classrooms, so you may get to meet a physicist who you never would have met before. There's blended mentoring programs here in New York that have done pretty well. So it's a pretty small market because no one wants to pay for relationships, but I think it's a critical opportunity that EdTech can pay attention to.
SES background of your students?
Really, really varied, and this is such an important conversation and piece to what we are working on right now, again, always going back to the piece of personalization and having conversations with the families who are excited to be a part of what we're doing, and making and prioritizing the things that are most important. Is it most important for students to know how to use our specific devices and technologies? Is it most important for them to be ready to collaborate, or is it most important for them to be able to talk about who they are and what experiences they're coming to the classroom with? And I think it always surprises me every single year when I meet my new crop of kiddos is all of their experiences. It's a really crazy time to be a kid. You're exposed to so much, and regardless of what you are capable of or where you are specifically living or your commute to school, you're coming in with so much and making that the platform to start an experience with.
Great. Go ahead.
Ooh, that prompted me.
Nancy Pells-Padgett with the Aspen Institute's Education Policy Program. I'd be interested, I think you've done a fabulous job in getting rid of a lot of the mythology that I think surrounds this world of so-called blended and personalized learning. But I would love to know if you have any insights, particularly given David's role and the fact that we're in a school related to a school of education. What is it that you could have seen that gets teachers to do this work well? Because it seems to me that's a hugely significant ingredient, and the resistance of traditional teachers to taking a leap into this new world is not insignificant. And I'm just curious if you have anything to observe, to offer or suggest for those of us who worry about how do you actually develop teachers in better ways to do this work better.
Yeah, so I think even from my own teaching experience, the most isolating thing that can happen to a teacher is only ever being in your own school. Because you only ever see the environment that you're in, you only see what the other teachers down the hallway are doing. So something that we're really deliberate about is getting teachers, especially those that are going to be using a new model, to go around to other places and see new things. So we have several different ways of building that capacity. Sometimes the most resistant teachers are not going to be the ones that are going to opt into that, but they might then, if their colleague goes and sees something that's innovative, they might be able to be exposed to that in a different way. So that goes back to my point also about having our own proof points within DC. Like, we can't send every teacher to California to see all the innovative things that are happening there, but we can send someone to Randall Highlands to see how teachers are interacting differently with students and with computers.
Yeah, I guess I caution against the sort of image we all have of this like old teacher that's shunning the computer. I think it's a little bit oversimplifying, and the Gates Foundation did do a pretty decent look at sort of called Teachers Know Best, looking at a pretty high rates of enthusiasm around digital learning. Now that's very different than saying this is the model that you will now teach in, right? So there's a chasm we have to cross there. A couple things that we've seen in our research. One is involving teachers as designers in the models themselves. They then become your advocates for when you inevitably see a small drop in outcomes as you're sort of getting the model underway, rather than sort of abandoning ship at the first sign of sort of anything negative. The other thing that we've talked less about today, but in some of these models, as you're shifting content delivery online, it's a chance to unbundle the role of the teacher from this kind of jack of all trades, Jesus plus Mary plus everyone else model that you can do everything, and you could actually specialize, right? And it's a huge opportunity, I think, to professionalize teaching. There's not that many schools going all the way on that front, but I think it's coming. And then the last thing I'll say is that there have been schools that have rolled this out year to year, such that students arrive, they've taken a 5th grade blended learning class, they arrive in 6th grade, and they demand blended learning. So that's an interesting lever to consider. It's a little more antagonistic as a strategy, but to have your students marching for blended learning, but it is a thing.
Can I make one more point on that? I think thinking about the motivation of why a teacher might not want to try something new is also important. So I think that it can be very overwhelming, the amount of data and the amount of programs and the amount of things that a teacher is expected to do, and now it's on the computer and I need to have 4 different logins, and there's just a lot of different things that can just feel so much, so you revert back to the things that are tried and true. And I've heard a quote before of being data rich but information poor, being very deliberate about what are we trying to get teachers to understand about the data that we're collecting about students and how to make it actionable in their classroom the next day. Because if they're not able to use it the next day, they're not going to use it, and we need to make sure that that's something that's happening.
Do you select for teachers who are comfortable, obviously, at this?
Yes and no, and I think teachers are really excited. The teachers that I know and that I've had the opportunity to work with in lots of different environments are really, really excited to try these things. They're really eager to, and just need either exposure or support or the tools and materials. And we get thousands and thousands of applications for what is now around 50 teaching positions. Because people want to be a part of this.
Great. Tony?
My name is Tony Picciano. I'm on the faculty here at Hunter College and the CUNY Graduate Center. I was very impressed with some of the things you commented. I thought the first question by David, I thought you had a really good answer. I don't think we need double-blind experiments in terms of what goes on in K-12. Very few people want to do that. But it's my own experience with actually studying this, and I was very happy to see your first chart, Julia, that data that you showed that comes out of Disrupting Class, right?
Yep.
That's based on research I did in 2008 and 10, and I had long conversations with Clayton and Michael
Yep.
in terms of whether those projections would hold. But my point is, I think that my own experience in looking at schools, and particularly urban schools like in East Harlem and in the South Bronx, the real issue with technology is not what the technology is, but how it's implemented. The support services in many of these schools are not there. And I would suggest if we're going to study this seriously, we have to do really kind of qualitative research, going into the schools and look what works and how it's implemented, more so than some kind of broad-based double-blind study. I would make one comment, although it's not K-12, it is higher ed, that would support the whole blended movement. There was a meta-analysis done by the Department of Education in 2010. They reviewed about 1,000 studies, and they selected about 50 some odd that were experimental and quasi-experimental, mostly higher education. Their conclusion was that of the three modalities, face-to-face, online, and blended was the only one that had some significant improvement. So I think there is support for the whole approach, but I think in terms of how we study, we need to study what's going, the implementation becomes critical and not necessarily, quote unquote, the technology. You can comment on that.
Yeah, just one response, right, when we think about that chart. So at that point in this sort of evolution, it was an access play. Purely, that was the metric. It was that, can I take an AP course or can I access credit recovery, where the alternative is nothing at all. We've moved past that, right? And we need to study it in such a way that reflects that, although I still think there's pockets where access is part of the equation.
Great. Yep.
Thanks. I'm not sure if it was double blind, but I just want to make note of a study that was done by the Gates Foundation on learning to read online, where the results were so bad they withdrew from it. I will send you the reference. But I want to ask you, given everything you've just said, how you take in the fact that the titans of Silicon Valley, who are behind much of all of this online learning, send their own children to not David Steiner schools, but Rudolf Steiner schools, where the children learn to knit, paint, don't even learn to read until they're 8, not a computer in sight. And when asked about it, the parents said, well, our kids have screens at home. We don't want them to have them at school. And I don't set this up as something, that it should only be about the color divide or the achievement gap or anything, therefore we have to have computers in all these lower grades. But don't you think it's a little soon to be doing this, say, in K-5?
Yeah, and speaking specifically to the models that we're setting up, our youngest students don't, or very, very rarely access screens at all. That it is a time for them to be kids. It's a time for them to learn and play and sew. And our pre-K class is studying Boris the panda bear and building habitats and talking about environment. And it's a slow integration where there's a time and a place, and there's a lot of research being done around the developmentally appropriate age to bring in screen time for students and how much that should be and what it should look like. But really, to me, teaching is about capturing that excitement that we all have when we're 3 and 4 and 5 at school and letting that continue and grow. And bringing in technology as a way to either document or further a curiosity or understanding along that path for them.
Great. Go ahead, Mark.
This is on that, related to that. Do you in the schools actually do any guidance for students in their leisure time with computers and technology and social media?
We have Facebook blocked. Facebook isn't a thing anymore for kids.
Yeah, they're not going.
It's so funny to me. The first thing I do when I get up or get to my computer every morning is log on to some kind of social media, checking LinkedIn or checking Facebook. And so when the kids get to school, and this is older students, 3rd, 4th, 5th graders, and they want to check the score of the Mets game or look at a Taylor Swift something, it's really hard to, I see my job as sort of their mentor through this in conjunction with their parents and with their own preferences. And how do we use this responsibly? How do we take the information that is there and they've got coming at them? They've got it coming at them when they walk through the mall or down the street or when they get in the back of a taxi cab. How do we teach them to be really good stewards of that information? How do we teach them, and when do we teach them what to question and what to accept and what to synthesize and think of as important, and when to limit themselves and say, like, it's time for me to take a step back and shut off.
And we have a digital citizenship course, essentially, where that's owned by our library media specialists team, and they're the ones that are implementing that during professional development for those folks, and they're sort of the owners in the building of those kinds of things. How do you self-regulate? What's appropriate to share online? What's not appropriate to share online? How should you be accessing that information?
I'll say if the pendulum swings too far, there are districts that have blocked Google, which I think is a human rights violation and insane, and it's like burning encyclopedias. So I think that digital citizenship is incredibly important and has to be countered with reasonable embracing of the fact that we have information at our fingertips.
We do
now.
have a filter. I do want to be clear. Like, we're not just like totally open. But
No, of course, with a filter. But just, I think that the opposite extreme knee-jerk reaction has come about in some districts and has greatly slowed the way that teachers could be leveraging technology and how kids need to be able to be in the world.
Peter, and then we'll take you. Go ahead.
I read a blog called in the Apple. In New York State, 20% of the parents opted out of the state tests. And they not only opted out, they formed a political movement. They endorsed candidates. Since David left as commissioner, the Board of Regents has almost totally turned over. The antipathy towards the state tests, teacher evaluation is enormous. One of the most popular blogs I wrote is R2D2, the teacher of the future. Are you aware of the antipathy on the part of teachers and parents towards blended learning and computerized instruction? They frequently, when I go to a meeting, it's attacked all the time, and parents see it as the way of making schools cheaper, getting rid of teachers. The same movement that grew to oppose standardized testing seems to be growing as far as the use of computers across classrooms. How are you addressing this growing antipathy, which I think Merrill Tisch acknowledged was a major mistake when they rolled out the Common Core?
So our most popular blog by exponential rates is called Will Computers Replace Teachers? It just keeps on living. It keeps beating all my blogs. It's not by me, which makes me mad. So you're right. There is this sentiment out there. I frankly think it's about a little bit of smart PR, a little bit of better research, and a lot of sort of letting educators see what this actually looks like and letting parents see what it actually looks like, which the best models, as we heard, are a combination of great teacher-led instruction and using software wisely. So that's maybe a sort of cotton candy answer, but I think it's a lot of myth debunking that still has to happen.
And I think also thinking about the role of online assessment, what are teachers expected to get from that? So when my students walked in the door in Charlotte, I would give them a diagnostic that I literally cut by hand and then made copies of on the result. Like, it was not the most effective way to spend my time. I don't think it was the best way for me to understand where my students were at. Being able to automate that formative assessment and think about and offer that to students, and then being able to take that information for our teachers, they have access to that stuff right away. I think that's a really important thing. I think speaking about the summative assessment and how that's growing and how that's tied into teacher evaluations might be a different question.
Yeah.
Yes. Well, then we'll go.
My name is Greg Martinelli. I'm an interactive developer, so I've been doing sort of interactive development for 25 years. So there's a lot been said here about assessment, which I think is really kind of a back end, and I wanted to focus for a minute on the front end. So when you are looking for curriculum programs, say in math or basic science, what is it for you that's going to make a successful program and not just a simple staircase?
I'll let you go.
Yeah. So I'll say two things. First, I think with every program that we evaluate, our standards get higher and higher. So if there's a program that offers a certain set of accessibility features, then we're going to demand that of most of our programs. So we want to make sure that students are able to, just able to access that content in ways that we might not have asked for 5 years ago. Science is particularly tricky because there's never going to be an online version of doing science that is going to be just like the real thing. But in terms of an accessibility conversation, not every school district for every 7th grader can afford to get a frog for every group of students, right? So maybe an online frog dissection was a classic middle grade student experience for science, might be an accessibility way that they can still learn that content even if they're not able to procure those materials. I think that the evaluation of math programs is also difficult, but it's a little different than science because it's more skill-based and thought out like that.
Yeah, just to build on that, and I don't know if you've seen this in DCPS, one thing we hear is, and this gets to the point of, are we going to use a bunch of programs versus the perfect math, the perfect science program? Kids will feel sort of fatigue and boredom if they're on the same platform over and over again, looking at the same animated penguin, right? And so, and so we have to think about that, and there's design choices that could shape what a particular program does in light of that, but maybe there's also procurement decisions that mean that we're allowing for variety, knowing that fatigue is a bit inevitable. And my favorite spreadsheet I've ever seen was a school that had started to sort different programs within the same subject, so 5 ELA programs, 5 math programs by use case, and where they were really thriving as a homework help tool, but not great as a sort of in-classroom group work tool, what have you. And so we're starting to actually differentiate, not by all the features and functionalities and animated creatures, but by where we're actually seeing the tool move students. So that's not, I'm not an instructional designer, I'm gonna leave that to you, but maybe more than just one animated creature would be my tip.
So I'm, I don't know if this is on.
Yes,
I'm Tina Collins from the U of T, and this is ed tech issue is something we've been talking a lot with our teachers about, and I'm hearing kind of 2 pieces of this, right? One is a lot of excitement around, we have a lot of teachers that use Google Apps all the time. They're very excited about using digital portfolios to track project-based learning, things like that. They're excited about the possibility of state assessments being adjusted in ways that allow English language learners and special education students to, be measured at their appropriate levels and using appropriate ways. On the flip side, they're very wary of a lot of money going into something that is for-profit and that is going to be outdated and that is just going to be a time suck, right? As David was saying, the pen stayed relevant for a long time, and there's many teachers who are questioning the time and money investment. And there's also a lot of skepticism around whether the exciting personalization available through this can be separated from this achievement gap question of, at the end of the day, if you're gonna have a standardized measure, that is where that achievement gap comes from, you're going to have a system where student data is collected in all sorts of problematic ways. You're gonna have all sorts of kind of the digital gap issue that exists. And so there's a lot of sort of big picture questions that they're willing to use it for their classrooms, but when it comes to broadening the policy, they are very, very wary. And so I'm wondering, do you see a way of actually doing one but not the other, right? Doing useful digital personalization, blended learning things that doesn't then get connected to the accountability, for-profit, sharing of student data things that are driving a lot of teacher and parent concerns around this issue right now?
No. Nope. The best predictor of future income is still the standardized test, by far. And when you speak to principals of underprivileged schools privately, they will often tell you that without that data, there was no way they could put a fire under anything. I think the there are real concerns in Bloom being the classic case of misuse of data, potential misuse of data. And that seems to me a problem that's both real and soluble if we have the laws that we need to solve it. But I think this is a question that I was speaking about with some groups earlier today who are interested in the new pilot under ESSA to do different kinds of assessments. Innovative, not the usual standardized, fill in the bubble. The question is, what are we actually testing, right? And you could say, well, we're not interested in what the standardized tests test. We're much more interested in sort of authentic, performance-based assessments. And then the question is, well, they may be more fun and they may be more involving for the children. What do they actually predict, right? What part of life in the future, what part of opportunity for these children, particularly the underprivileged? And as yet, we don't really know the answer to that question. We know it for standardized tests, but we don't know it for these other forms of assessment. And until we do, there's a real civil rights risk in all of this. And the only thing I would add to the conversation is that my skepticism about constructivism is not because I want to be mean to kids. And it's not because I don't think that wonderfully taught constructivist classrooms can be the best of all. My English classroom in a state school in England was actually a theater, and we put on scenes from plays 5 mornings a week. That's pretty constructivist. But by and large, constructivism, when not done well, is worse than old-fashioned teaching for children. And so I think the question really becomes, if we're going to make this big bet on different kinds of assessment, different kinds of teaching, being careful about data, what are we really doing for the underprivileged children? And that's, I think, a question that this sector still has to answer. Is that fair?
I am not going to disagree with you, Dave.
It's allowed.
That was beautiful. No, I mean, I think it's right. I think the one thing I'd nuance on the sort of for-profit concerns, I share some of your skepticism, but I also am thrilled that private capital is going into public education, and we just have to control it the right way from the demand side, right? Because if we manage to get the demand side right and protect data right in the right ways, we're actually getting R&D from the private sector, which we've sorely lacked in education. And so that's the one part where I think we can oversimplify and actually potentially miss out on a boon from the R&D of tools that we otherwise just wouldn't have, because we don't have DARPA and we don't have sort of the federal funds going into that. So
I want to thank the panel and thank the audience. Thank you very much. Thank you so much. Thank you. Thanks so much.